Hey guys, welcome back. This is going to be a pretty special episode because we're finishing our first book today. We're going to look at the end of Philippians chapter 4. We're going through verses 10 through 23. So if you haven't already opened your Bible there, go ahead and do that. As usual, let me give you a little bit of background information that's going to be relevant for you. The first is, remember, I haven't said this in a while, so you may have forgotten, Paul is still in prison. But what I want to add on to that is to tell you that the Philippians have had a history of supporting Paul in his ministry. We find this in verses 14 through 16 when Paul mentions how they've supported him in the past. And this is important because one of the main reasons why Paul wanted to write to the church in Philippi was to thank them for their ongoing service. See, what happened was they sent Epaphroditus to meet Paul in prison in Rome. And now that Paul has received the gift from Epaphroditus, and also Epaphroditus stopped being sick, remember this from the end of chapter 2, Paul is sending him back with this letter to thank the Philippian church. In verse 13, when Paul says, I can do all things, he's not talking literally that he can do everything like fly, shoot laser beams out of his eyes. What he's talking about in context, when you look carefully at verses 10 through 13, he's talking about being able to be content in any circumstance, whether he's hungry or well-fed, whether he's rich or poor. He's able to do all things, to be content in all of these situations. And then in verse 17, when Paul says that he seeks the fruit that increases to their credit, Paul's not talking about literal fruit. He's talking about the results of gospel ministry, the efforts that he personally puts in to share the gospel with people and to raise new churches in new areas that the Philippians support. They're getting credit for the work that Paul is doing because they supported him. And lastly, in verse 18, when Paul calls their gifts a fragrant offering and the rest of the stuff that he says, he's basically comparing their contribution to Paul as an act of worship to God. And now, when you read this passage for yourself, let me give you something to focus on. Ask yourself, what does this passage teach you about the importance of gospel ministry? And when I say gospel ministry, I mean sharing the gospel. So go ahead and take some time to read it for yourself. And when you're ready, come back and I'll give you a takeaway. So the takeaway that we get from this passage is basically to tell us that everyone who is involved in gospel ministry is important. The person who goes to share the gospel with people who have never heard it before, or people who have heard it before but don't believe yet, as well as the people who send, the people who support the missionary. Just for example, Paul and the Philippian church, both are important. And what we have to let sink in is the fact that both of these roles are so important, so neither one can be neglected. On the one hand, we here have an opportunity to share the gospel with our friends, to talk to the people whom God has put in our lives without going anywhere else. We have that opportunity to share the gospel. But also there are people elsewhere around the world, not in wherever you live, who also need to hear the gospel. So it's also our role to support people who will go and do missionary work. Both are absolutely important. Because if no one supports the missionary, how are they going to go and be missionaries, right? So a practical takeaway for you would be to get to know the missionaries that your church supports. If there's a link on the website that has a list of all the missionaries your church supports, read about them. If they don't have info about those missionaries, ask the church for the information. Say you want to start praying for the missionaries because this is important work and you want to do your part, whether you're supporting by prayer or supporting by contributing money. Well, thanks for going through Philippians with me. Next time we're going to be starting Colossians, so I'll see you then.